Hello, everyone. Welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on Fraud Prevention Techniques, Financial System Controls. Today, we have both Chuck Hayes and Kathy Dwyer to present. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go over all questions at the end. Thank you, and I'll now hand it over.
Thanks, Colleen. So my name is Chuck, and I manage all of the application consultants that work here at Zobrio with our various systems. Today we're talking specifically about MIP. And then also on the call is one of our application consultants who also works with MIP, Kathy Dwyer. She's located up in our Boston office. So let's talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish today, and then we'll kind of tag team the conversation as we go along. So the topic is fraud prevention techniques, and we want to focus on two aspects of fraud prevention. The first has to do with what we'll loosely call internal controls, and then also controls you can use in the financial system. I want to just mention a little bit about how this all came about. So one of our CPA partner firms has a CPA, Greg Shin, who works with us on implementations for specific customers. And we've had conversations with him about this whole issue of fraud prevention, and he does presentations on them. I've also participated in those kind of presentations in the past. So as we thought about the different needs our customers have, we thought it'd be good to kind of do a little brief overview of, I'll loosely call these considerations. So let's talk first about the issue of what I like to refer to as fraud temptation. So obviously we don't want anyone working at your organization or affiliates to in any way commit fraud. However, there are some ways in which that you can make it, shall we say, less tempting for fraud to occur. So the four specific areas that I wanted to just kind of raise some questions for things for you to think about are the areas of cash management in general, purchasing, especially thinking of accounts payable, for example, expense reimbursement, which might be related to accounts payable, and then financial statements. So let's just raise a few issues for you to think about in terms of your internal controls or possible circumstances you might want to make sure that you investigate. So with cash management, there's a very large question about, well, what about unreported cash? You know, if you've got folks who are taking in cash or even checks, but who's handling it? And what kind of review are there? Are you making sure that it's not possible for someone to take some cash and then never report it? You know, what's your logging process? Who does data entry? All those kinds of things. Those are certainly considerations from an internal control standpoint. Cash. We'll talk a little bit about the actual data entry side of controlling fraud potential, if you will. When it comes to purchasing, some of the possible scenarios that have occurred in organizations is using either fake or inflated invoices and then essentially embezzling money as a result of that, or creating fake vendors and then redirect, and then along with that, fake invoices, and then possibly in addition to that or as part of that, creating redirecting payment, you know, like, so who has control over addresses, who does the verification? So that raises questions about how do you make sure that there is some sort of separate review process to make sure that, well, actually that is a real vendor, and oh yes, we really did get all those goods and services, or those services were performed. So it's one of the types of things that you want to take a very close look at exactly what are the potential breakdown points in that whole process of everything related to purchasing. And expense reimbursement can be a variation of that depending on what your overall procedures are, but a big area there is credit card charges. So, you know, when you get, do you require receipts? What's the threshold for receipting? Are those receipts detailed versions of a receipt or just a summary? How do you match that against, you know, the vendor or service provider? If it's travel receipts, you know, does it make sense? You know, is it in the right geographic area? You know, things like that can really get involved because the potential there is for someone to disguise charges or, you know, kind of work around the policy in some way or again, you have the potential for fake receipting. You know, with today's printer technology and things like that, you know, there have been stories in the press about people who were able to generate, you know, very convincing receipts that look like they came from, you know, restaurants or things like that. So again, you just want to take a very, very close look. And then this last one for reporting in Excel that I especially like to bring up. So it's not at all unusual for organizations to use Microsoft Excel to pull together information and rearrange it in ways that make sense for report distribution, say to a board, a finance committee, or other, you know, types of entities that are somehow reviewing. But the moment Excel is being used, you raise the possibility of some sort of fraudulent reporting. So someone could alter the numbers. And even if you're printing out Excel so it doesn't even look like it came from Excel, you know, you still have to think about that. So one of the things that I like to point out is that you want to make sure that any version of reporting that is not directly coming out of the system really should have backup reports that do come from the system that tie correctly to the numbers that are in whatever rearranging is done in something like Excel. So again, just to recap from an internal procedure, you want to think about what exactly are we doing, and just, you know, take a real risk assessment. At what point in any of these procedures could something go wrong and we're at risk for some sort of fraudulent activity that then, of course, obviously affects the organization's reputation, et cetera. So now if we start to transition a little bit more into the concept of, well, okay, those make sense in terms of your workflow and what goes on there, but what about system considerations? And we have some screenshots coming up, and Kathy's going to talk about our cash management system, and we'll talk about some of the settings that are available in MIP. But again, just to think about it overall from an overall process, it's more about security settings within the system. That's where the primary focus will come. There may also be settings in the system, and Kathy will talk about some, MIP has some, where it's more about processes as far as how something, you know, flows through the system and who can do what. But generally speaking, we usually refer to it as security. And so as you think about your procedural workflow, then you also want to tie that to the system workflow. So if you've identified gaps, close them up in just internal procedures, internal controls, then kind of map them to the system that you're trying to use, and then that then informs security considerations around all of these different aspects that we're discussing. So for example, and I'll let Kathy talk a little bit more about that, but in our Zobrio cash management system, we do have some security options that can help you, especially with the cash management side. So Kathy, did you just want to talk a little bit about that in terms of choices people have?
Sure, thank you, Chuck. Basically what happens with the cash management system is a user is assigned to a predefined role. And exactly what a role is it controls what functions you may perform in the system. And it can run the gamut from being just maybe what we refer to as a remote user that keys in receipts that they collect, and they turn them over to a treasurer or an authorized agent, and that completes your participation. Or it could run all the way the full gamut of total admin rights to the whole system, where you can enter receipts, you can deposit them, you can report on them, you can turn them over to accounting. And there's all levels in between those two extremes. Now, what ends up happening is with the cash management system is we have what we call our audit trail that we work closely with some of our external auditors to say, what are you looking for? You know, what are the keys to fraud detection? And some of them could be as simple as a user enters in a transaction, prints a receipt to hand it to the payer, and then lo and behold, that receipt gets deleted and the money disappears. Well, what's nice about the cash management system is we track things like that. We track entries that are keyed in, that are deleted, and there might be a legitimate reason, hey, I made a typo, but it sets up basically a trail and patterns of things that are going wrong. But as most systems have a level of security, same here with the cash management, you tried to different roles or functions that you can do in the system. And further, you can be restricted to say, hey, you know what? I work in the remote department. Maybe I'm in the police department. We can restrict your activities to a predefined set of accounts or what we refer to as sources. So in general, we have different ways, whether it's at the user level, whether it's at the account level, to basically say, this is what I'm going to allow you to do. And oftentimes, too, I like to say to people, don't think of that as a negative. Sometimes it's good to have security because it protects you from, any conjecture that you're doing something wrong, but it also has this internal audit trail which allows an administrator to review and, quite frankly, look for improprieties, or it also helps and to look to see if somebody's having difficulties and might need some additional training. So from a ZCM standpoint, Zobrio Cash Management, that's a very generic overview of what our security does.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we think about the MIP system, we also have this concept of security around specific records and procedures as opposed to necessarily the role. But the idea would be that you would figure out, okay, so the person who is the data entry person for AP or the finance director or something like that, what kind of access privileges do they need, similar to what Kathy was discussing with the concept of roles. And what you want to be thinking about is how would that tie to some of the choices that are available within MIP. And I've just shown a few here, where at the record level on the left-hand side, you can say, well, are you allowed to get into employee information and payroll? Or what can you do in a vendor record? And the VE, like view and edit and delete, is the traditional privileges of what you're allowed to do within specific records. And that way, like something simple as not being allowed to delete a vendor. Now, there are restrictions around deleting vendors when they already have activity, but things that you want to make sure that, like Kathy was saying about, the system will maintain some audit trails, but you also can preserve records without allowing certain entries to be removed, and then you can restrict who can actually edit them. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see procedural options. So for example, you could have person A who is allowed to enter the invoices, but maybe they can't post them to the general ledger. So you want to make sure that a different person actually is reviewing or authorizing that process after some sort of internal review process, or who's allowed to write checks, or even something as simple that's not really, I'm digressing here beyond just the system, but I forgot to mention that earlier, like, okay, if you've got pre-printed checks, are they locked up? And does someone have to sign off for the ones that they're taking off? I worked with one organization where it was a pretty elaborate sign-off procedure. You had to, okay, I need 10 checks with this, what's the next range? Here's the range I want. And then you had to get them from person B. You actually had to sign a form that you would take them out, and they had to initial that they had verified that you were given those checks. So, that would tie with what you see here about, well, can I even write a check, for example? So when it comes to, ways we can assist you, and I've got one more slide here, but I just want to mention something now, that, our help desk can certainly point out, oh, here's where security is located, or here's where this privilege is, and you can check the box or not. But one of the things we like to suggest is to think about our assistance with a full security audit. And we can go through both your internal controls. Okay, well, show us how you process invoices, what's involved. And then we also can help you map that to the system and then look at everybody's roles and come up with recommendations and then put the settings in place for you. So that's the type of approach that we've done with a lot of our customers, and it's something that we can do for you all as well. And then one other option within MIP are alerts. So you can get an alert that someone changed the vendor's name. So that goes back to closing the loop on, okay, wait a minute, why was someone changing the name of a vendor, and who authorized that? After you've already locked down who's even able to do it, then you can deal with that kind of stuff. Or, someone changed an employee's pay rate. Those are good examples where, wait a minute, we want to make sure that we know that that's happened, and have we already put controls in place to make sure that someone isn't inappropriately doing that. So that kind of concludes our overall discussion about internal control considerations that you want to think about and some examples where fraud could potentially occur, as well as a brief overview of some of the major ways in which our systems can help you lock that down, primarily through security settings. So as I mentioned before, our sales manager, Matt, would be happy to talk with you about doing a full security audit and just making sure everything's in place. And I know that over at least the last 5 to 7 years that I've worked with customers, I've been hearing that more auditors are requiring that the organization produce information about, okay, well, what are your controls in the system and who has access to what? And we can certainly help you with that kind of reporting and making sure that you're able to satisfy the auditor's concerns, or at least to demonstrate what's going on in the system. So you're welcome to use the chat to go ahead and shoot over some questions, and we'll be glad to answer them. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much for attending today, and I know Colleen will be sending out links to our recording. So Colleen, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, everyone. As Chuck said, a recording of the webinar will be made available shortly.